The death of Al Jazeera journalist Anas al-Sharif in Gaza City yesterday is not just another casualty of war, it's an event that strikes at the very heart of press freedom, the protection of civilians, and the moral legitimacy of military action in conflict zones. On Sunday, in a targeted strike near the al-Shifa hospital, Israeli forces killed al-Sharif alongside several colleagues, Mohammed Kreifa, Ibrahim Zefer, Mohammed Nufal, and Marmen Aliwa. The Israeli Defense Forces insisted that al-Sharif was not a journalist but a Hamas cell leader involved in planning rocket attacks on Israeli civilians. Al Jazeera, the United Nations, and the Committee to Protect Journalists reject these claims outright, calling the strike a premeditated attempt to silence one of the last independent voices reporting from northern Gaza. This isn't the first time such accusations have been made in the aftermath of a journalist's death. The CPJ notes a troubling pattern. Israeli forces kill a journalist, then issue a posthumous declaration that the individual was a militant, often without presenting verifiable evidence. In al-Sharif's case, Israeli intelligence points to documents allegedly seized in Gaza, but no independent body has been allowed to examine them. Meanwhile, the only people who could corroborate the facts on the ground, international journalists, have been barred from Gaza since the war began nearly 2 years ago. This prohibition leaves local reporters as the sole witness to the destruction and places them in extraordinary danger. Al-Sharif was acutely aware of that danger. He had publicly stated that Israel's allegations were part of a campaign to assassinate me morally before killing him physically. His words carry the eerie prescience of someone who knew his death was not a possibility but an inevitability. And just minutes before the strike, he documented intense bombardment on social media. Hours earlier, he had recorded his final message to the world, entrusting Palestine's cause to every free person and urging them not to let chains silence you nor borders restrain you. This killing comes against the backdrop of an Israeli plan to seize and occupy Gaza City, a plan that former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has likened to ethnic cleansing. By removing the last remaining local journalist, the IDF is, whether by design or by consequence, clearing the information battlefield ahead of this occupation. The symbolism is unmistakable. Before you erase a person's home, you erase the record of their destruction. The scale is alarming. According to Gaza's media office, 237 journalists have been killed since October 2023, the vast majority Palestinian. The CPJ says 178 of them were killed by Israel. In modern warfare, that's an extraordinary toll. For comparison, in the entire Second War, far fewer journalists died in the line of duty, and most of those deaths were accidental, not the result of deliberate targeting. Killing journalists is more than a war crime in the legal sense. It's a direct assault on the world's right to know. The Geneva Conventions protect journalists as civilians, and international law is clear. The burden of proof lies with the military to demonstrate combatant status before attacking. Even if al-Sharif had political sympathies, and there's no conclusive evidence that he did, the act of journalism does not strip away those protections. Historically, regimes that target journalists are signalling both weakness and intent. Weakness because they fear that documentation will undermine their narrative. Intent because such killings often precede escalations in military campaigns. We've seen echoes of this in the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, in Sri Lanka's civil conflict, and in Russia's actions in Ukraine, where journalists have been abducted, tortured, or killed. I think it's interesting that this story emerges now, partly because it was in the Crimean War in the 1850s that journalists were first embedded with troops and sent messages and sent reports back to the newspapers in the UK and the US. And the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression warned last month that Israel's claims against al-Sharif were unsubstantiated. That warning now reads like a formal notice that the international community failed to act upon. The fact that his killing was followed almost immediately by intensified military action in Gaza City, lends weight to the argument that this was about information control, not battlefield necessity. Al-Sharif's death also exposes the hypocrisy of those who speak of democratic values while remaining silent on their violation when politically inconvenient. If 237 journalists had been killed by Russia in Ukraine or by China in Taiwan, there would have been sanctions, emergency debates in Western parliaments, and resolutions in the UN Security Council. The muted international response here suggests that press freedom is being applied selectively, and that's a dangerous precedent. This matters beyond Gaza. If powerful states can kill accredited journalists and justify it after the fact with untested allegations, the entire international protection regime collapses. It becomes open season for reporters in every conflict, from the Sahel to South America. Al-Sharif once said, "Gaza is dying and we die with it." If the world does not move today, tomorrow there will be no one waiting to be saved. His murder, and that of his colleagues, is not only a tragedy for Palestine, it is a test case for whether the international community still believes in the idea that truth has a right to survive war. As a parallel to this, I know from talking to people in Ukraine that Western journalists are specifically targeted. Russia sends drones into hotels that it knows that journalists are staying, particularly in places like Odessa. And so this is not exclusive to the Israeli command. It's also to be seen in the Russian war against Ukraine. But the killing of journalists is not collateral damage, it's the destruction of the very possibility of an honest historical record. And if we accept that this is happening, then the rubble of Gaza will one day cover not only the bodies of its people, but also the gravestone of truth itself. We need to call this out. We need to stand up and say this is absolutely wrong, and this demands an international response and condemnation. In the same way that we condemn Russia, we must condemn Israel for the brutality of its attack and for its targeted attack on truth and on journalism.